Hello all, thanks for having me today for this talk about cognitive science and climate change. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I live in Paris and it would have been a bit absurd to take a plane to come give a talk in Fiji. But I'm sure you're having a great time. My name is Albert Moukheiber. I'm a PhD in cognitive neuroscience and a clinical psychologist. And today we're going to be talking about how cognitive science can help with climate change and the ecological transition. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can have my slides and then we'll get going. Okay, so I think this could be good. So how does cognitive science help us understand climate change? The first thing we can start with is what is cognitive science? And cognitive science is an interdisciplinary and pluridisciplinary field that has very wide branches, but all of them are interested in understanding the individual and collective behavior of our species. So, for example, in cognitive science, you can find disciplines such as psychology, philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, neuroscience, or artificial intelligence. I'm in neuroscience and psychology, but in my day-to-day life, I would work with philosophers, linguists, sociologists, anthropologists, ethologists, etc. So how does cognitive science can help understand climate change? The first thing we can tell, at least in big parts of the Western world, at least in Europe, is that most people today accept that climate is changing. However, we're not doing much about it. And this is where this is where cognitive science, sorry, can help us with understanding climate change. Because there's something very important to understand, which is humans. So if we do a small recap about how we function, we can summarize our functioning in the following simplified um, framework. When you acquire information really quickly, you're going to integrate it in your knowledge system. We all have a knowledge system. It's how we think things work. We can have knowledge about ourselves, about others, about climate, but also about tech, about social networks, about planes, about food, etc. The way you acquire knowledge impacts your belief. So it's how you organize your knowledge together. The belief that you want to act on in the real world is an intention, and an intention that you actually manifest in an action is an action. Now, you can have different and various degradation levels at those different levels. You can be exposed to bad knowledge, which, for example, fake news, which will impact your belief, your intention, and your action. You can have good knowledge, but have a bad belief. For example, let's say the rooster crows and then the sun rises, and we think that it's the rooster that is making the sun rise. The knowledge is true, but the way we organize the knowledge leads to a bad belief. It's not the rooster that is making the sunrise. Or, for example, in our topic, yes, climate is changing, but it has nothing to do with humans. The knowledge is true, yes, climate is changing, but the belief that it has nothing to do with humans is wrong. We can also have a good knowledge, a good belief, and no intention of acting on it. For example, I know that smoking kills, but I'm a smoker, yet I don't want to die, so I have no intentions of stopping smoking. We can rationalize. I can tell myself everything kills us, we're all going to die eventually. I just want to profit from my life. And finally, we can have good knowledge, good belief, the intention to act, and not being able to actually do it. And this is a very important concept in cognitive science, especially for climate transition, which is what we call the intention action gap. Because we hear intentions, again, at least in Europe, from a lot of people, from citizens, from businesses, from even governments, saying climate change is really important. We should really do something about it. So everyone is declaring these strong intentions, but we don't see any really significant action happening. So it's important to try to understand what widens and what narrows down this intention action gap when it comes to climate change. And we'll be doing this in two different moments because we are individuals, but we're also social animals. So we're going to see first individual factors that impact our inability to act and widen this intention action gap. And then we'll see uh, group impacts and what are some more systemic factors. Because the biggest issue, I think, is thinking that the solutions will happen at the individual level. This doesn't mean the individual is not important. This is why we're starting with the individual, but the group, I think, is more important when we have these macro levels and challenges such as climate change. So at the individual level, what are the factors that are coming at play? The most basic one, by far for me, is habits. We're just used to having a lifestyle that isn't helpful for climate change. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on habits because there's not much to say. We just have a lifestyle that led to climate being degraded, so it's hard to go back. But this is really the first and most superficial factor, and we're going to try to dive a bit deeper on all this, and then we'll see where it leads us. So once we're done with habits, we can, as I was saying, dive a bit deeper, and we can look at something called, sorry, learned helplessness. So what is learned helplessness? Learned helplessness is a factor that was discovered in the 60s, and I'm going to explain to you a bit what it is. We're going to start with the training phase, and then we'll see what is the experimental phase. So it's an experiment that was done in the 60s or the 70s, I don't really remember, on dogs. So I'm sorry about what's going to happen. Uh, Animal welfare is really important, but it is what it is. And I'm going to try to draw a bit here. I'm not really good at drawing, but it should do. So we're going to take two cages. These two cages are identical. Each cage has a lever in it. Each cage has a sort of light bulb, and in each cage we're going to put a dog, two different dogs. We're going to call this dog A, and then we're going to call this dog B, and we're going to do classic training for the dogs, like almost Pavlovian or reinforcement learning. And the thing goes like this. Again, I'm sorry for what's about to happen. When the light dims, what the dogs don't know is that the floor of the cages is electrified and can deliver electric shocks. So when the light dims, dog A gets electrocuted. Dog A doesn't want to get electrocuted, so dog A doesn't know what to do. But at some point, dog A will push on the lever, and when dog A pushes on the lever, the electric shock stops. We want to teach dog A that they can act on the factor electric shock. We're going to do the same with dog B. When the light dims, it announces an electric shock. Dog B gets shocked, but once dog B pushes on the lever, nothing stops. The electric current keeps on going. And after a while, dog B realizes that they can't do anything. So when the light dims, an electric shock is coming, dog B will crouch and cry and wait until to stop, wait for it to stop. And when dog A knows that when the light dims, dog A knows that an electric shock is coming. So in anticipation, dog A pushes on the lever and then avoids the electric shock altogether. So this is what the training phase is. Now we're going to go to the experimental phase. And at the experimental phase, what we see is a bit different. So this is the experimental phase. You can see that this is the new cage. The new cage is almost identical to the first cage, with the only difference is that in the new cage, a tiny plank is now separating the cage in two, and we don't have the lever that we used to have here before. And the dogs don't know, what the dogs don't know is that this part of the cage is actually electrified, whereas this part of the cage is not. This is dog A, so we take dog A, we put dog A in the first half of the cage. The light dims, which warns of an impeding shock, but dog A believes that it can act on the factor electric shock. Dog A goes, "Oh, where's my lever? I don't have a lever." But dog A believes that they can do something about the electric shock. So dog A start exploring, and dog A is going to realize really quickly that this side of the cage is safe. So every time the light dims, dog A knows that it has to go to this side of the cage to be safe. I think you can imagine you know where I'm going with this. When we take dog B, We put dog B in this cage. Dog B has no physical problems. Dog B can run, dog B can jump, dog B has everything that's normal like dog A. But dog B believes that they can't act on the factor electric shock. So when we take dog B, we put them in this cage. The light dims, it impedes of a shock. Dog B believes they can do anything about electric shocks. So what does Dog B do? Dog B crouches down and starts crying until the electric shocks go away. Dog B could have avoided the electric shock. They just have to cross over this tiny plank of wood. But the belief of Dog B makes it not even try. Dog B develops what we call learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is the impact of our beliefs on our ability to act. If we feel helpless, it erodes our ability to act. And climate change is an excellent learned helplessness production tool because climate seems so large, so much bigger than us. It's about the acidity of the oceans, the melting of the poles, um, hurricanes, uh, flooding. How am I, tiny, puny human, going to face this? So we feel helpless. And even when we do put the effort, if you are engaged in climate change and fighting climate change, and you actually try to change how you eat, you try to change your transportation mode, every day you have news coming that things are getting worse, which makes you even more helpless. So the first factor is, other than habits, I'm not going to mention habits anymore. The first factor is actually learned helplessness. The second factor is the actual opposite of learned helplessness. It's when people overestimate how much they control things. In learned helplessness, we underestimate how much we control things. We could control things, but we think we can't, so we don't do anything. The opposite of learned helplessness is illusion of knowledge. And an illusion of knowledge is the opposite of what we were seeing. We have many cognitive biases of illusion of knowledge. The most known one is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect, we have this weird graph going on where the less you know about a topic, the more you would have a tendency to overestimate um, your knowledge. And the more you're an expert of something, the more you tend to underestimate it, or it's better calibrated depending on the papers. And how does illusion of knowledge illustrate itself in climate change is by either thinking that it's not going on, that these are the natural Earth cycles because you read some papers on geology or the history of Earth, or the new version of climate denial, which is what in France we call technosolutionism or technosolutionism. I don't know if the word exists in English, but basically it's people that believe that technology will save us. Like we don't need to do anything. Recently, I was seeing a talk by one of the members of the board of Google. I think it was Eric Schmidt, and he was talking about AI. And the interviewer was telling him, but like AI is a huge polluter. You need servers and you need so much energy to make it run. How are you going to reconcile this with climate change? And his answer was really dramatic and shows this whole techno-solutionist, technocratic view of climate change, which goes against almost all experts on the topic. And he said, yes, it's true that AI will pollute a lot, but it's our best bet because maybe if we run enough AIs, they will find a solution for us and then they will solve it, which is really mental and demented. And in this case, the problem isn't ignorance, but illusion of knowledge. It's like almost hubris. And finally, the crowning jewel of topics on the individual level that gives us an illusion of action in this case is personal effort, thinking that through personal individual effort, we'll have enough people to actually change climate change. When we know that most of climate change is due for a very tiny fraction of humans, you realize how much this is absurd. Actually, this happened to me recently. So like I was saying, I try to avoid to take the plane as much as possible for climate reasons. So I decided to take the TGV, the French train. So I boarded the TGV. It was like a 6.5 hours ride, which I could have done in maybe 45 minutes by plane. But what are you going to do? I'm used to being helpless. Um, So I take my train and I get hungry. So I decide to go to we have in the TGV restaurants in the train. So I decided to go to the restaurant to see what food they would have. And then I discovered to my great surprise that they were selling chips, crisps or chips with Himalaya salt. And I'm like, was really depressed because the salt came from the Himalayas, from the other side of the planet, when we have like Camargue salt or any other table salt would do. And I was on this 6.5 hours train ride trying to do personal effort, and the chips had ruined all my carbon footprint, paradoxically. It doesn't mean that personal effort is not important. Of course, personal effort is important, but it can have really paradoxical effects, such as learned helplessness, if we don't systematize it. Like we've never really were able to change anything in human societies through personal effort. You can't have people put their seatbelts on through personal effort. You can't have people not smoke indoor through personal effort. At some point or another, you need to systematize it. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So these are the main personal issues. But I think the more interesting and important ones are the group ones, because contrary to what we believe, our behaviors are not the fruit of our brain. We are not a brain. We are not a brain in a vat. We have what we call in cognitive science embodied cognition. Our behaviors need three things to be explained. You need to understand brain activity. Of course, I'm a neuroscientist, and the mental stuff we are telling ourselves. I'm also a psychologist, but also it depends on our physical capacity, the state of my body, but also on the interaction of my environment. And our behaviors are the result of the feedback loop that is constantly going between our mental processes, our physical processes, and our environment. And in climate change, the environment is really, 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 really important to understand why we're not doing anything. And it all starts with social context and social norms. It's very complicated to be able to to change when the whole environment around you is constantly prodding you not to. You have fruits in plastic containers, whereas fruit come in nature with their own containers, but they put them. You have plastic straws everywhere. How can you eat less meat when you have a McDonald's at every corner, at every street, and meat is constantly glorified as the best food on earth, and we're making bigger and better and more polluting planes. This is what uh, the most reports on climate change call enabling conditions. You cannot expect people to change if you don't create the correct enabling conditions. And enabling conditions are really central if you want to make change. You have to create a correct environment that promotes change. Otherwise, you're just shooting yourself in the leg. You're doing what we call paradoxical injunctions. You're telling people take less planes, and then you're showing them ads saying Paris, New York for 50 euros. You're telling people eat less meat, and then you're opening even more McDonald's on every street corner. You're telling people use less plastic bags, but then you're giving them tote bags every other day, and everyone now has a tote bag full of tote bags in their houses. Another factor that's really important at the group is what we call diffusion of responsibility. It's how every industry tells itself, why should I start with me? Maybe somebody else should start, or why should I do something? Maybe someone else will. So diffusion of responsibility and shared responsibility. And finally, the last group dynamic I want to talk about is interpersonal. Bad systemic dynamics can cause catastrophic results. And there's a researcher called Eliezer Yudkowsky that identified three systemic dynamics that can lead to catastrophic outcomes. And unfortunately, in climate change, we have all three of them. You usually need only one to lead to catastrophic outcomes, but we have all three. The first one is when the decision makers don't have any skin in the game, or worse, would lose from it. We know today that the top 0.1% of richest humans are causing most of the damages that are made, but also that these people are those that impact legislation the most. And if we have to do what we know we should do, these people have the most to lose. So it's like we're asking people to shoot themselves in the foot, and they won't. The decision makers have very strong incentives to not change the situations because they are the people that would be the most protected. If I am Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or I don't know which new billionaire or soon to be trillionaire, and I live in an area that's being devastated by climate change, I can just take my private jet and move to some other place on Earth that has better climate or better conditions. The second one is asymmetrical information. It is how we actually got here, because I don't know if you know, but you probably do. We've known about climate change, at least in the scientific community, since at least as early as the 1950s. But this information was not moving around in a symmetrical way to everyone. If we knew and acted, if everyone knew and believed the scientist in the 50s, in the 60s, and acted on him, we would have organized our societies differently and we wouldn't be here. So it's really important for information to circulate properly in a system to be able to face it. And finally, systems that are dysfunctional in a manner where no single entity can implement a solution, even if theoretically a coordinated action through magic could solve it. And what Yudkowsky means here is that there are some topics where we know what the solution is, but we can't implement it because we would need a huge coordinated effort and we are not able to actually implement it. And this is the case in climate change. Like we all know what we should do. We should produce less, we should pollute less, we should consume less, we should grow less, be less attached to GDP and all these incarnated measures. But we can't coordinate each other. So if a country goes, okay, I'm going to stop my economical growth, they would instantly be worried that another country might beat them and then their economy would collapse. But if we could all discuss together that we're going to coordinate it and tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., we'll all get into this new model, we would. Unfortunately, we don't. So these are the two main pillars I wanted to talk about, the individual and the group pillar. And obviously the translational relationship between the individual and the group is crucial for a group to function properly. So we need inciting environments, physical environments and social environments, and a coherent systemic coherence between them, and the importance of systemic coherence between them. Get to my conclusion. What can we do about it? The most important thing is to understand that you need both top-down and bottom-up activities. You need to work on the environment, not the climate environment, the environment of the individuals, societies, the organizations of cities, and also work on the individual level. Why? It's important to work on the individual level so that when you systemize something, it is accepted. Like, let's say you tried to pass a law that bans indoor smoking in the 60s, before everyone knew that smoking kills. Probably no one would have respected this law. You need education, you need individual uh, initiatives so that when you systematize, people actually accept and go with your law. When the law to ban indoor smoking in France passed, people thought we had all the TV saying, what? In France, they used to have this ritual of smoking and drinking their coffee every morning. We call this café clope for those that speak French. So people are like, what? Our culture is going to change. It's going to be a nightmare. And then nothing happened. People just accepted it. The second thing we can do is what we call research action. It's like try to iterate stuff on the ground with people that are impacted by what we're trying to iterate. So define and diagnose, design an experiment, implement it, evaluate it, adapt, redefine, and re-diagnose. This would look like this. Identify a local specific problem. We don't always have to talk about climate change in a completely disincarnated way. We can talk about specific things. A river drying up in a certain place, fish needing to be protected or creating protected marine areas in certain places, fighting floodings by reorganizing how we devegetalized a city and then maybe recreate more permeable soils so that the water can be absorbed instead of having uh, uh, concrete that blocks the water from sweeping through the earth. So we can identify the problem, decompose it into small parts, then do a diagnostics, which can be qualitative, quasi-experimental, experimental, or through data analysis, define a strategy, experiment, evaluate the impact, and then go all the way back. To finish, I can do a talk about climate change without talking about two topics that are really important for me as a psychologist, as clinical psychologist, which are solastalgia and eco-anxiety. I don't know if you're familiar with these terms. If you're not, I'll explain them really quickly. So solastalgia is a form of, it's related to depression. It's when you lose a place that was really important for you because of climate change. For example, you grew up in a certain forest where you remember hearing the birds, seeing the butterflies, and a lot of plants. And when you go visit now, it's completely silent because of climate change. So that's for solastalgia. It's really hard, and we're seeing it more and more. And eco anxiety, as its name suggests, is more towards the future, is when we're really anxious because of uh, the future being bleak. The word is not really properly chosen because anxiety is usually an irrational fear about something that's not really dangerous. And in the case of eco anxiety, it's quite irrational fear. The problem is that it becomes totally invasive. The person can't think about anything else, and it becomes really bad. And we're also seeing it more and more, especially in the youth, because we tend to think about climate impact as just an impact on nature, but the impact of climate is also on health. It's on medical and physical health because of changes in fitness and activity levels, heat-related illnesses, allergies, increased exposure to waterborne and vector-borne illnesses, mental health, stress, anxiety, depression, grief, on social relationships, substance abuse, and PTSD. And finally, on the community health, again, our cognition is incarnated. So it's really important to understand we are not the fruit of only our brain. It's always the interaction of our brain and our body and our environment. So community health is also impacted by climate change, increased interpersonal aggression, increased violence and crime, increased social instability, and decreased community and cohesion. And if we want to have a chance of fighting climate change, we need to take into account the human factor, not just nature. We are part of nature. The biosphere is part of nature, and we also have to take care of all this. I hope this talk was interesting and stimulating for you. Again, I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but we're all in this together, and I hope we try to at least reduce the damages and get a fighting chance. Have a great seminar, and maybe we'll see each other soon. Thank you very much, and bye bye.